Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is something that I refer to as a cocoon nursery, which really just means I harvested a couple worm bins, and their labels are right here. It was a 350-day-old worm bin and a 326-day-old worm bin. They had received 30 and 25 feedings respectively, and after we hauled the worms out of that material, I just sort of screened the material and separated the worms that way. We were fairly certain that there'd be a whole bunch of stragglers remaining in that finished castings material. And not only that, but a whole bunch of cocoons, thinking that if we left a little bit of time, that those cocoons might hatch, and then at that point we can sort of round up not only the stragglers, but also the baby worms. And yeah, look at that. We got a whole bunch of springtails hanging out down here within this system, enjoying the moisture that's recirculating. So that bait box just loaded up with some bedding, some food, in the hopes that we can round up whatever worms were left behind and whatever baby worms hatch. It takes worm cocoons like 3 to 4 weeks to hatch, so we can probably expect another couple weeks of this system running as is, and then hopefully we'll start seeing a pretty good turnout in that bait box over there. So my abbreviation for European nightcrawler is ENC. These are European nightcrawlers. So what happened with those worms that we hauled out of their old castings 12 days ago was what you might expect. We launched off a couple new worm bins, and my old stuff is off to the left, meaning that the newest stuff is over here to the right. And those two new worm bins live right here. And after 12 days, I think I'm ready to check in on them, see how they're coming along. I've got a pretty good assortment of yummy watermelon and strawberry to give them. So we're going to get them up on the bench and get them fed. So let's get to work. Before getting my hands dirty, I thought I'd share some information with you. Some of it we've already touched on, such as the age of the parent bins that these worms were hauled out of, 350 and 326, having been fed 30 and 25 times. European nightcrawlers. So these, like we always do, when I launched those two new systems, these two ones right here, bins number 1, bin number 2, based on everyone's feedback in the comments from that video that I created when we launched them originally, and I could post the link to that video, right up here on the top of the screen. If you haven't seen it, if you're interested in checking it out and contributing your estimate too, I take everyone's estimate and average it. And that includes my own estimate too, and what we came up with so far, it's inconclusive as far as I'm concerned, is that bin number 1 is thought to have somewhat fewer worms living in it, 140 fewer worms with an estimate of 2,039, and over here in bin number 2, 2,179. And I think that pretty much covers all the bases. So why don't we get to feeding these little guys? The stuff I made reference to earlier, that assortment of strawberry and watermelon, is right here in this plastic tray. This stuff right here, though, is my mosquito dunks solution. It's just the brand name for this BTI bacteria. And if you've seen this stuff before, then you know that it's just like a little round biscuit that you throw into your pond or whatever standing water you have on your property where you don't want to see mosquitoes breeding. And it's been found that the stuff works pretty good in preventing fruit flies and gnats too, so I've had good luck with it in the past, and that's the reason I've got it here in my wormery, because we're going to apply a little bit of it before we get started to try to prevent any sort of outbreaks of flying insects. I was just trying to separate this coffee filter from the top covering newspaper, because the coffee filters in my worm bins generally serve the function of feeding zone indicator, but you know what? I have a feeling attempting to separate that thing from this top covering newspaper is going to result in it becoming shrapnel. So why don't we just leave it attached if that's what it wants to do? And I've got a feeling we're going to have the same story here. So since I don't have replacement coffee filters to deploy as new feeding zone indicators, they'll simply get the old ones back. And it's kind of just a tradition. It's not too hard to figure out where he last fed. I don't know if it's visible on the camera, but there's a fairly significant dent, a little gully running down, and I could see some of the little flying insects. I don't know if they're visible on the camera, but here and there I could see them buzzing around. And that's the reason I like to try to spray this stuff in the very beginning, because those flying insects will have made themselves at home on the very, very top surface. So since I want this stuff to treat the flying insects, and more specifically their larvae, I think now is the time to apply it before we start stirring everything in and blending it all together. This way we've really targeted what we're trying to hit with the stuff, and now it's probably safe to begin blending things in. So all this material out on the top, this is not evidence of the worms going crazy and producing pounds of vermicompost in these past 12 days. This is simply the material that accompanied the worms when we separated them from their lovely castings. These things were just large enough little boulders that they also got caught in the screen that we were using to separate the worms from their castings. And at this point everything's being blended in, and I got a feeling if we look down here, I don't remember what types of foods we placed in here for them, but I assume that since that was where we put the food in for them, that's where we're going to find a large number of the worms hanging out. So as you can see, each handful of material that I excavate is full of worms, and now you start to get a better sense of what type of material these systems were built out of. Mainly a combination of shredded cardboard and paper with some leaves mixed in. And I thought I saw a little shred of some sort of leftovers. Like I said, I don't remember what we put in here as the food for them. Even before the worms came in, we had dropped in the food. But I mean, something like this, the stem of a pumpkin, this would have just accompanied the worms from their previous home. So sometimes when you got a slow composting item like that, and it's time to move the worms out of their old environment into a new environment, some of those old things just need to accompany the worms into their new space. This to me looks like possibly the skin of a cherry tomato, and all the little tiny seeds of the cherry tomato are still in there. So now we're starting to see some clues of what they were given last time. I've got a funny feeling that what we're giving them today is going to go quick. A whole bunch of juicy, delicious fruit, watermelon and strawberry. That stuff's not going to last. That's almost for sure. So whether or not we have to come back in here in 12 days or not, it's really up to me, I think, because the let's not disturb the worm count by moving worms from one bin to the other. Not that that really matters. So yeah, like I was about to say, even if they eat up all their yummy kitchen scraps, all that watermelon rind and all that strawberry, if all that stuff gets depleted in a couple days, that's just fine, because they can simply continue nibbling on their bedding, because basically paper, cardboard is all wood pulp, stuff that the worms see as a completely reasonable food option, as long as it's nice and damp. So you don't have to worry so much if your kitchen scrap supply in your worm bin has run out, so long as there's enough bedding for them to continue nibbling on. And I had almost forgotten, I should have probably put that information onto my little green information board, but what you're seeing here is another thing that came over with the worms from their old environment. And this was a bag resembling plastic, but labeled clearly as compostable. And I can't really remember even a ballpark figure how long it's been since we've been trying to compost that thing down. But as you can see, it is making some pretty decent progress. It was sort of holding together, but I've got a feeling that this little tiny strand right here, which is the only thing that seems to be holding together two of the pieces, oh no, maybe that's not the case here. It is still holding together. That's just sort of the very bottom of the bag. The top of the bag I had originally tied a knot into, thinking that if it was a bag for a while that worms might crawl into the bag and then find themselves unable to get out of it, and that might cause problems. And that was the main reason I wanted to sort of seal the insides of the bag to be inaccessible until such a time that it degraded to the point where the worms can come and go into it and out of it at their own discretion. But in the beginning I just didn't want to have worms crawling into it and finding themselves stranded inside of a bag that they couldn't get out of, and then possibly starve in there, or whatever possible bad things could happen to them. So I think we've made a nice little hole here into which we can place a replenishment of their food supply. And here again, I'm always kind of looking for little scraps of what might have been placed in here last time to see how they're coming along, but now it almost feels like I'm stalling, so let's move on. I'm going to grab my prepared bedding because even though there's tons of bedding in here, I like the idea of always including a little bit of bedding with every feeding. So because that's something I like to do, I keep a collection of prepared bedding on hand. It's just shredded paper and cardboard into which I mix a bunch of leaves, and then I dampen the whole concoction. And we certainly don't need much, but we'll drop in a good generous handful onto which we can place today's feeding. And over time we'll just keep doing that each check-in. Keep trying to build up their space. As they break all the existing bedding down further and further, we're just replenishing it with more and more so that there's always a plentiful supply. So there's a good bit of stuff here, but if you ask me, the majority of what I'm feeling here as far as weight goes is moisture. It's really just water content. And you know, another thing that I've got going on over here that I'm thinking I'd like to plop in is, let me grab some here. I think I've got about 2 large handfuls, so if I grab one large handful, we can place it into one of the bins. It's a whole bunch of corn cobs that I had sort of hacked up into small pieces and left them to dry for many weeks at this point. And I just found that I had left the stuff to dry perhaps a little bit too long. And then my little personal blender, my Magic Bullet, really just struggled trying to break that stuff down. So I think that if I try to do this again in the future, I will probably not wait so long and not let it dry so much and shred this stuff up while it still has a little bit of moisture content and when it can still give, you know, instead of being so tough and resistant to being pulverized. So yeah, this is what I was after, was sort of a stuff that's this consistency, sort of little flakes, because that stuff I keep in my freezer and I add it to my worm bins and it just goes in as, you know, regular feedings, and it just seems like it manages to get eaten much more readily than something like this, because it takes a while for the worms to be able to break through a chunk of corn cob. They'll burrow their way into the middle of it, eat out the center, they'll eat off the kernels, and then the rest of it is a little bit tougher. Takes them some more time to break it all down, and eventually it all goes over time. But it does get a little bit tedious, always bumping into the same corn cobs over and over each check-in, waiting for those many months that it takes for the stuff to break down in the worm bins. So I just thought I would see what I could do about, oh my goodness, I have a big chunk in here I didn't even realize. All I really did was I grabbed a bag, a freezer bag, and dumped it out into this tray to let it all thaw, not realizing that we had a fairly good size hunk of material right here. So perhaps what we can do is use this hunk as our motivation for the worms to continue breaking down this lovely piece of compostable material. I know it's not plastic, so I'm trying to not call it plastic, but maybe what we can do, oh wait, guess what? I just noticed that there's 2 of them. So, in the interest of being fair, I don't need to worry about one getting one of these and the other one not getting it. They both get one. Wow, that's a nice, generous pile of delicious food for these yummy worms. Yummy worms. For these lucky worms getting this yummy treat. No, that was not a Freudian slip. I do not eat worms. And I'm wondering, what do we do with this juice? I mean, this is stuff that the worms are going to really like, right? So, you know what? I've got some dry shredded paper. I'm thinking I could soak all that stuff up into some dry, and then we'll sprinkle that in here too. But why don't we sort of cover up the feeding zone? I'll go grab some of that dry stuff and bring it over here. But before we do, I'm just going to cover up the feeding zone, get things leveled off here, see how things look now that we've added some bedding, blended in all the compost that came with the worms when we launched these systems 12 days ago. And yeah, like I said, visit my video from the worm launch 12 days ago, because I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts. If you've not yet contributed your estimate for how many worms are thought to live in these systems, I'd love to hear if you know, your estimate complies or comes close to what our average is coming out to be. But I also don't want to, you know, have anyone swayed with what's turning into the averaged estimate. I'd rather just hear what people think without being influenced in any way. So definitely check out the video and let me know. And at some point in the, you know, in the near future, we'll start to see fewer and fewer people contributing their estimates, and at that point we'll sort of make that estimate into the official worm count for these 2 systems. And don't forget, we're going to be bringing stragglers in here, baby worms that are being baited out of their old castings that were left behind. So I know that at some point we're going to be increasing the number of one or both of these bins. Sometimes I just use that haul out of stragglers as a reason to try to build up the, you know, population in what's thought to be the smaller or lesser populated container. And you know, at this point I'm thinking, why don't we just drip this stuff right in? No need to go grab dry bedding to soak this stuff up. We'll just pour it straight in and we'll be finished. And you know what? Just for good measure, I know we applied a good bit of it and it's all been blended in now, but I think just to play it safe, I'm going to apply a little bit more of this Mosquito Dunks BTI solution to the top surface here, and then this way we're definitely, you know, giving the whole system a good inoculation. And you know, something I had put out here for myself to apply with the feeding and I totally forgot to do so was this pulverized eggshell, which is what the worms utilize as grit in my systems. Some people will pulverize a variety of different types of materials, perhaps crustacean shells, whatever you got on hand. If you have nothing else, you could just use some nice clean playground sand. And then the worms use that tiny particle matter stuff in their gizzards to break down the foods that they eat. And some people will tell you it's not necessary, it's not important. In fact, I've seen some worm channels conduct tests to verify that theory and run bins without any grit. But hey, if you've got eggshells that pile up and you want to try to do away with them in a responsible fashion, then putting them in your worm bins along with the rest of the household scraps that you process in your worm bins seems like the most sensible place to put this stuff. So that's why I give it to the worms. Not to mention the fact that whatever calcium content comes through with the eggshells and ends up in the castings that the worms produce will eventually be fed to my plants in my garden and also benefit them in the long run. So there's numerous beneficial reasons to include pulverized eggshells, from minimizing the amount of stuff I contribute to the local landfills, to giving the worms what they need, and ultimately giving additional nutrients to the plants in my garden. So that's it for our check-in, our first check-in since the launch of these systems. And, you know, like we saw in the beginning, we're going to be checking in on those cocoon nursery worms over there too that are coming together in the bait box. Like I said, we're going to let that go a little longer. Perhaps the next check-in won't even include a check-in with those little guys, but at some point in the future we will be doing a haul out and a reunion of the worms that live in there with the rest of the gang. So be sure to come back and join me in those future visits. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to my channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.